I can't see anyone anymore. So I start relying on y'all to let me know that you can still hear me and you can see my screen. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and say yes.
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 Yay.
Yes.
All right. All of the technology is working for us this morning. So once again, welcome to part 2 in our Development Ready webinar series. Today, our speaker is Joe Borgstrom, who I'll introduce in just a second. My dogs are also extremely excited about this webinar series. So we're going to give everyone just a little tour of the Google Meets functionality. So we do ask that you keep your camera turned off to minimize visual distractions for the group. It also will increase your bandwidth, so things will keep moving more easily for you. Stay muted unless you're speaking. Take advantage of the chat box and the raise hand feature if you have questions. And we do want to note that this webinar is being recorded. Liliana, if you haven't started, there's the cue. And will be made available at a later date for you to watch a second time, because I know that Joe is going to have so many great tidbits for us. Y'all are going to want to watch it a second time. You're going to want to share it with your friends. You're going to want to watch it on a Friday night with a glass of wine in your hand. So turning your microphone on or off is the little microphone icon there at the bottom of your screen. Camera on and off is the video camera. Raising your hand, of course, is there as well. Settings, if you go there, you can change your background, make things blurry, or put something fun back there, like a spaceship maybe. And that red button is hanging up and leaving the meeting. So don't do that to mute and unmute yourself. I do that all the time. You can see the little person icon there in the bottom right-hand corner, and that allows you to see who is in the room, as well as the chat helps you keep up with everything. So last week we heard from Eric and Elizabeth with Incremental Development Alliance, and we do have that recording posted on our website. We can get that link to you if you missed it. And today we are really excited to welcome Joe Borgstrom with Place and Main Advisors in Michigan, which is in the Eastern time zone, as we're learning this morning, for those who may not have known that. So without further ado, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Joe. Oh, I will mention, Joe, confirm for me, we said you want to take questions as you go?
Yes, please.
Excellent. So anyone who wants to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and that will be our cue for Joe will be able to hear that, and then we can have you ask your questions. And thank you everyone for joining us.
All right. I'm assuming that's my cue to go.
You are on and we can see your screen.
That was going to be my next question, so I appreciate that. So much like Rebecca just said as she was presenting just a few minutes ago, I can only see my screen. I can't see any questions popping up, so I'm going to rely on Rebecca and some other folks to chime in and let me know when you have questions. I will also tell you that I'm a big believer in having conversations around this stuff. So as we go, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them as we go. This presentation will be much, much shorter if you don't. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get going with this presentation on marketing and promotion for attracting developers. So before we go, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I have spent 25 years in economic development, and I used to think that was a lot until I realized how much gray hair, of which little hair I have left, has. And I say, yeah, it's 25 years about right. So I've spent my career doing economic development. I started my career doing traditional economic development, going out recruiting businesses and doing foreign direct investment recruitment. Somewhere along the way, I found the gospel of Main Street and learned all about downtown revitalization and placemaking, and really fell in love with that. And I was able to kind of to merge those two passions, and really I specialize in most of the economic vitality aspects of Main Street, a four-point approach. But really where we've really, over the last 6 years as we've launched our firm, we've really started to specialize in what we call place place-driven economic development and destination storytelling. And my expertise in particular is in real estate redevelopment, market analysis, and strategic planning. And in addition to my credentials, I'm an economic development finance professional with the International Economic Development Council. And then I was part of the inaugural class to receive the certification in leadership and place management through the International Downtown Association. Our firm has been around since 2016. I previously worked for the state of Michigan, and I got to oversee the Michigan Main Street program, obviously the sister program. And at the time, we were part of the State Housing Authority, which was the only other state agency that state housing agency that housed the Main Street program was Virginia and Michigan. So I've always had a fondness for you guys because your structure was much like the one that I came from. Over the last few years, we've been quite busy. We work all over the country. We've been doing things called what we call real estate redevelopment plans, and I'll talk about those probably in a little bit. We've done resource teams. We were part of COVID response teams during 2020 and early 2021. We actually piloted the real estate redevelopment plan as a concept in Conway, Arkansas, way back 3-4 years ago. Obviously, we do a lot of work here in Michigan, which is our home state. We do a lot of economic development strategies, highest and best use studies, and what we call pre-development services, which is essentially a lot of redevelopment planning and RFQ development. And I'll show you some examples and talk more about that here in a little bit. In addition, we do a lot of work with the Missouri Main Street program. We're actually I'm part of the City of St. Louis Main Streets team there, where we're doing real estate redevelopment plans, entrepreneurship enhancement plans, retail recruitment strategies. And then we've been doing some work in Washington State as well, which we're currently working in the Seattle area on an economic development action plan. And then we did a strategic tourism plan for Pullman, Washington. My business partner is my wife. We've been doing this since 2016. She actually started her firm, which was Pubhound Public Relations, in 2010. And in 2020, we decided to not to have two different organizations. We merged them into one. And yes, for those of you wondering, she's the boss. She's the majority owner of the corporation, but we seem to get along really well. And this has been an awesome journey for the last 6 years, and we're looking forward to many more years of this. So the goal I want to get into a little bit, and I've got, I don't know, something like 60 slides, and I will probably fly through those, and hence the need for conversation and questions as we go. But there's really two main goals, in my opinion, when we look at trying to attract developers to a community, or try to attract just new property owners in general. One is typically the first and primary goal is to get a property into the hands of a good owner. I think way too often we see speculative buying happening in communities, especially when Main Street efforts begin to be successful. So we start to see people buying on speculation. What we really want to do is get the building in the hands of a good owner, and that could be taking it from something that's publicly owned, or just has a problem property owner. But overall, the idea is to get the property in the hands of someone who's going to do something with it, do something for the benefit of the community. The second goal is we want to make sure that we're creating good relationships with local realtors. One of the things that we need to realize is that the professional real estate industry is there to support what we do in Main Street, and we should be supporting them. We need to think about it at the core, outside of your economic development organizations. Their job is to sell your community on a daily basis. They do it depending on where you are. So a lot of smaller towns will have a handful of realtors who do both commercial and residential. Larger communities, you'll have folks who do solely residential and solely commercial. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure you've got good relationships with all those people, because we find them to be incredibly useful, and they're all in all looking to do the same things that we are, which is trying to find ways to improve the community overall. So before we get into marketing and promotions about how to attract a real estate developer, there's a few things that we need to make sure that we keep in mind before we even do that. So the first thing we want to make sure what we're doing is, are we looking to just simply fill a space, or are we looking at the whole scale redevelopment of a property? Now, when everyone was introducing themselves along the side chat there, I could see that there was a number of communities from areas that have, I know there was folks talking about their IRF grants. There were folks, from port cities. There's, all kinds of folks that are in the room today. And the question really comes down to, are you looking to refill an existing space, whether that's commercial or industrial, or are you truly looking at redeveloping a property? And redeveloping a property may mean a change of use. It may mean, a number of other things, but you really need to understand what your end goal is. Is it simply to fill an empty building? And that's a fine goal to have too. So I don't want to necessarily, belittle the idea of just filling a space and marketing property, because we're going to touch on marketing property in general, and then we're going to talk about specific redevelopment marketing. One of the things that I've been astounded at over the last, several years, and we'll go into more detail in just a second, is the lack of understanding about the development process as it occurs in your own community. And overall, I have found that a lot of communities, it's kind of a mystery. I've worked with communities that were industrial, urban, on a waterfront, and you go to talk to them and say, well, why hasn't there been development there? And the response is, well, and it gets quiet, and you kind of have to pry a little bit. And the response is, well, the people who knew what that was, how that process worked, they don't work here anymore, and no one really seems to know how all this stuff works. So it's important for us to get that understanding. And in some communities that capacity is left. In a lot of communities, that capacity doesn't exist at all. And so it's important for everyone to understand kind of the overall development process and where marketing fits into all that, and the things that you need to do before you even market. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. And then the other thing you need to understand is, before you market, you need to understand your market. You need to understand the data behind who you are and what you're about and what you're trying to do. And we'll talk about all that here in just a second as well. So any questions so far as we get going about, what we're trying to get done today? I'm going to go with silence as a no. All right. So in my bag of slides that are really convoluted and maybe difficult to understand, this one's actually pretty straightforward. It's a lot of stuff, and this is a little bit of a fire hose slide. And when I say a fire hose slide, I mean it's like drinking from a fire hose. If you're not familiar with the development process, one of the things I did a number of years ago, actually back when I worked for the state of Michigan, was we realized that there was this limited capacity at the local level that understood the development process. What specific steps are there to developing a property? And so I put together this chart long ago. I've dug out over the last couple of years, because we're running into the same issue as we've talked to communities around the country. And what I really want to talk about is, we're going to talk about kind of the pre-planning steps. But if you are kind of in the dark a little bit, or afraid to ask about, how does all this stuff work? All the slides are going to be available. As a matter of fact, they're already they're in Rebecca's hands and the team there. And those will be posted as part of this as well. So you'll be able to reference this. But this is essentially, you're looking at what is this, a 19, 20 steps process where we talk about planning and pre-development and development. So when I talk about the development process, when you look at this chart, you see developments all the way over to the right. That's literally steps 11, 12, 13, 14, and essentially the end. So there's, 15 steps, 16 steps before all that that go into development. And that's something that I think that we kind of gloss over a lot. And when we talk about marketing, we're going to talk about stuff like that are on steps 1 and 2 in this chart. So there's pre-development steps, planning steps, this development steps. So we're going to talk about all those and kind of how those affect here right now. One of the things I think it's really undersold is that the probability of your success is improved when a community is ready for redevelopment. Now, this seems like a pretty, benign statement, so to speak. But what really you need to understand is that you really need to make sure you know what's going on. You understand how the process works. And one of the things you should probably know about me as I present, and I should have warned Rebecca about this before, is so I generally say I work on a PG-13 level when I present, because I'm the son of a Marine and a 25-year skilled tradesman. So I've learned some colorful phrases over the years, and so I occasionally try to pepper them in. But what I really want to get across with this statement is really, if you've never heard of the 5 Ps, which means proper planning prevents piss poor performance. If you've ever been in the military, I'm sure you've probably heard that phrase. But this idea that we need to make sure that, I'll use another phrase that a consultant friend of mine taught me years ago, you need to have your poop in a group before you go out and try to market your community to developers. Like, you need to understand all the different steps that are going into this, and we're going to dive into those right now. So first and foremost, the very basic first step of redevelopment is, has your master plan been updated lately? There are communities that we worked in where they've updated, where they're faithful in updating them every 5 years. In Michigan, we cite 5 years as the best practice. As a matter of fact, it's part of our legislation. But what we've actually come across is, communities who haven't updated their master plan in 20, 40, 50 years with the justification of saying, well, our city's built out. We don't need to have a master plan anymore. Everything's built. What we know is, over the couple hundred years that we've been here on, as part of the United States, is that our communities are constantly changing and evolving, even if they've already been built out. It's important that from the very base step in your first step of planning is that the property is identified as part of an area, if not on its own, in your master plan and identified for redevelopment or reuse. The next step in all this is making sure that if there are any districts that need to be aligned to include the property, and this could be brownfield, it could be tax increment financing, it could be community improvement districts, any of these districts that that can be made in advance that may be able to help the project. Again, you want to get this stuff in sync before a project actually comes to the table. It helps shorten the development timeline, and it helps make the process go smoother as we go. The next step is the appropriate zoning in place. If we're dealing with a former industrial site and the vision is mixed use, is mixed use allowed? There are communities that we've worked in where they really wanted to do upper floor redevelopment or to do mixed use housing, and frankly, mixed use is illegal. Matter of fact, I'm working in a community right now where mixed use isn't even identified in their zoning. So, as we look at marketing a site and we're putting together an RFQ package for them, we've kind of just told them, listen, we need to stop right now because you need to make sure that anything that we cook up with these ideas of working with the community and coming up with these grand ideas of this mixed use building on this space, it's not even legal. It's not even allowed in your zoning. So you want to make sure that the appropriate zoning is in place before you look to market a site. This is another important part. Have your local processes been mapped? Does the development community understand, or is there a way for the development community to understand what steps they need to take in order to navigate the development system within your city? I will tell you that, again, this is something of a mystery. If you talk to city planners, if you talk to the people in the building department, if you talk to people within the city, they all know it. They all understand it. But if you were a mom and pop developer, if you were a mid-level developer and you walked in, would you know what that process is, and is that easy to understand? This is one of those areas where I think a Main Street organization can be incredibly valuable. We've seen this happen in a number of places where you've got cities who have limited capacity from a staffing standpoint to be able to put together a process map where they tap their economic vitality committee and or their design committee to work with the city to develop these local process maps. And I'll give you an example right here. This is the city of Grand Haven, Michigan, which is a part of the Michigan Main Street program, and their economic vitality committee did just that. They worked with the city planning department to put together a process map. This is just the site plan review process. There's, I believe, 6 or 7 of these in their whole system that they can easily just take this one pager and give it to a potential developer and say, what do you want to do? Here's what you need to do. One of the things I love about the process map as they've done them is that if you look at this, it tells you who they need to meet with and what that timeline is that goes with it. I will tell you that, making sure that there's a timeline in place, that timeline is followed, is really important. What we want to try to do is do a couple of things for the development community before we even market to them. Is one, we want to make sure that we've defined what steps we need them to take, how long do we estimate that to take, and then to actually follow through on that. And it's what I found is that you can take less time than what you tell somebody, but you can't take more time. As an example, I've dealt with developers my whole career, and one of the things that I have found is that you can tell a developer, well, our process takes 6 months, and they're not going to be crazy about a 6-month process, but they'll understand that. But if it takes 6 months and you do it in 4 months, they're not going to be upset about that. But if you tell them it's going to take 4 months and it takes 6 months, they'll be upset about that. So it's about setting the expectations, because time is money to them, and we want to make sure that as a developer looks to redevelop that property, especially if they're purchasing the property outright, that we can minimize that downtime, that transition time from its current state to what it's going to be, by having a easy to understand, streamlined review process for any types of development that they want to do. Are there any questions so far on what we've talked about?
We have one question. How does a master plan relate to a comprehensive plan?
Oh, geez. Okay. So I'll be honest. I'm not a planner. I'm an economic development guy. I know a lot about the planning process, and different states call them different things. But typically a comp plan is a master plan, depending on where you're at. In my state, we refer to them as master plans. We don't refer to comp plans. Unless you're referring to, comp plan, so terminology gets a little wonky here. So there's the comprehensive plans that we've seen that are essentially master plans. And then there is also the economic development planning documents, which are also called comprehensive plans. It's something that's required by the federal government. So the terminology is a little wonky. So how the master plan fits into the document that is required for federal funding, you want to make sure that those projects that are identified in your master plan are reflected in that comp plan. If it's two different terms for the same thing, then it's two different terms for the same thing. I wouldn't necessarily worry about that part. But if it's for that document, and that's typically done by your regional planning commission that does the federal planning documents, comp plans. But if we're talking about the overall comprehensive plan for a community, it's essentially the same thing as a master plan. Any other questions? All right.
No, we're good. Thank you.
All right. So you need to understand about your market. You need to understand the demographics of your market. You need to understand the trends of your market. And there are some factors that are more important than others. I'd love to see when communities do a big data dump and they put everything in there, and then I've seen communities put as little as possible. And the honest answer is you want to kind of do focus on a couple of small things. So you got to remember, when you're marketing your community, that you don't need to do the full-fledged data dump. This is you're marketing your community. You want to get people interested. And it's important to understand that a lot of this research happens online before people even step into your door. So you want to make sure that you're including enough pertinent information, but you don't have to give them the whole thing. But nor do we want to give them nothing. So the key factors that we've found in redevelopment. So obviously household income plays a big role. What the current rent rates are, and we'll talk about pro forma development here in a minute. But it's really, really important for us as we market our communities to understand what those commercial lease rates are, what those residential rent rates are. So as a developer is interested, one of the first things they're going to do is they're going to start penciling numbers. They're going to start figuring out, all right, can I build what I build here, and will it make enough money for me to be able to pay the mortgage and be able to make a profit off of it? So household income, rent rates are important. Construction costs. There's really, we're looking at construction costs and rent rates being the biggest factors that we're seeing right now in the development world, where there's a shortage between the rent rates that a potential project can get and the cost of construction to create that project. So what we're seeing is this gap between how much it's going to cost and how much you can rent for. And that's what we're seeing a lot of projects stalled. But understanding kind of what those construction costs are on a per square foot basis is important for estimates. And then again, being able to have good relationships with the construction companies to be able to introduce them to these developers if they don't already have those relationships. And then retail leakage, I think, is also important. It helps give a potential developer to know the potential for businesses. And this is a little bit of an industry term, Most main streeters should probably know what retail leakage is, but if you don't, retail leakage is the difference between supply and demand. So every market area, and I'm always cautious, I say a market area, because retail markets don't really follow necessarily city boundaries or county boundaries. So it's really kind of that area that makes up the customer from a daily basis. But to understand how much purchasing power occurs within that market is really, really important. And then to understand what that supply is. And so if there's more demand than there's supply, we have what's called a gap. So that means that, let's say that there's a community. And by the way, I'm going to stop real quick when I talk about retail leakage and I talk about purchasing power. I think every community realizes they have purchasing power. I don't think every community understands how much purchasing power they have. And what I mean by that is, if we were to take a look at any one of your respective retail leakage radiuses, if we're looking at that market, my guess is that, probably for the smaller communities, and I mean this sincerely, for the smaller communities, my guess is that your total demand, your total purchasing power is between 200 to 300 million. And for larger communities, it's probably in the billions. And that may sound ridiculous because those are kind of cartoon-like numbers when we start talking about that. But that's what the facts are. And the facts is that our communities have a tremendous amount of purchasing power. Even small rural communities have the ability to have a lot of purchasing power. When we get into more urbanized areas, larger cities, there's obviously more purchasing power. And what we need to figure out is that difference between the supply and demand. Now, if there's a lot of gap, if there's a lot more demand than there's supply in a lot of different areas, well, then there's opportunity for tenants. If there's way more supply than there's demand, well, that's what's called a surplus. And if there's a surplus, that means that there's more supply than there's demand, which is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but it just means that bringing in new businesses may be tough depending on what those sectors are. And I say these macro numbers of 200 to 300 million or $1 billion. All of that, whether it's a good market, whether it's a bad market, all that kind of is paired out in your market analyses as you do this type of work. And what will probably happen, and depending on where you get these sources, and the sources could be places like Esri, or it could be, Claritas. We do all of ours with Claritas as an example. There's a couple of other firms out there that do this, but they go into subcategories, and those subcategories in Claritas, as an example, goes to like 108 categories. So there may be one or two areas where there's a lot of surplus. Gas stations, we find this. Fast food places, we find it a lot. Car dealerships. There are those sectors where there's a lot of supply, and there's too much surplus because there's too much supply versus the demand that's there. But there may be opportunities within that. So my overall take on this, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little in the weeds, is that the retail leakage piece is important because we want those potential developers to understand that they can find tenants at the end of the day. And then lastly, yes.
We have a question asking if you can define purchasing power held by a community.
Perfect. So this is the amount of money. When I say purchasing power, it's the total demand, which means the total amount spent currently by the community. And that's an aggregate number. So if you have household spending of $45,000 a year, you times that by the number of households that you have, and that gets you your basic aggregate number. And again, this is all fun. You can find that in stuff like Esri, which a lot of municipalities have access to through their planning departments. But by purchasing power, I mean literally you take the household spending category, times it by the number of households, and that's where you get that number. And I'm sorry for getting down a little bit of a rabbit hole on retail leakage, but it's one of my favorite topics. And then we get into incentives. That last factor is important too, because as I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about the rent rates and construction costs, that creates this gap. This is the types of, and you don't need to get into nitty gritty. All you need to do is say, here are the types of incentives that we have potentially available for your project. And the key is potentially. It all depends locally on what you have. It depends on state programs. It depends on, what other incentives may be out there for that particular project. But just simply listing what they are is important. So a potential developer understands like, okay, I'm going to need to ask about this, and this. So let's talk a little bit about audiences. There are three types of developers. I'm sure there's more, but I like to kind of just get into the general three topics, or the three categories. First are the mom and pops. The second is kind of the mid-size or regional developer. And then third is the big time developer, the big boys, where these are folks who are doing big projects in big cities. So I'm gonna go into more detail on all three of these here right now. So the mom and pops, for smaller communities, if you're probably 15,000 or less, this is probably going to be your main category of developer. There you probably get other smaller regional developers. That certainly is not out of the realm of possibility. But in a lot of, especially our rural communities, mom and pops are the primary developer. And who's a mom and pop? A mom and pop are literally usually like a husband and wife or dual spouse household, where they have no background in development. They're typically just locals with capital. And by that, I mean typically doctors, lawyers, and dentists. And I'm not joking that out of the small developers that I've worked with over the years, I'd say probably 75 to 80% of them fall in one of these three professions, because they're folks who generally they have a lot of capital. And a lot of times too, they're what we refer to as DINKs. And that's one of my favorite acronyms: double income, no kids. These are folks that either kids are grown and gone, or they just didn't have any kids, but they essentially have a lot of disposable income. And they're typically 15 to 20 years away from retirement. So they're thinking about things like their legacy and what kind of improvements can they make, or they love, and what happens a lot is that, they'll go on a trip to Europe, they come back and they say, that's so awesome, I'd love to be able to do that here. And then they see the potentials here and go, oh, wow, this is something we could possibly do. And so they're looking at that 15 to 20 year time frame, where they don't have an immediate need for that revenue. And these are great for small projects with small returns, which frankly is a lot of buildings in our small downtowns. And the reason that they're great is because of that 15 to 20 years. They don't need the access to that capital. They don't need that money from that project. They just need that project to break even for a good 10 to 15 years. And that's pretty much what we're looking at when we look at these longer return on investments for smaller projects. So these are really ideal candidates. And the challenge with the mom and pops is that lack of background in development. And what happens, 40-50% of the time is that they get into a project and realize it was going to be as expensive as it was going to be. And they end up probably putting in more money than they originally anticipated, but they're usually committed to the community. They're from the community. They typically don't invest outside of where they live. So they're going to be there for the long haul. And while they may not be thrilled with the short-term investment, they will be there for the long haul, and they will get the long-term investment out of it. So, but these are great groups to work with. They're well-intentioned. There's not a whole lot of stretching of the truth that goes on, because they just don't know. They don't know what they don't know. And there's pluses and minuses in that. And if you guys, I know you guys heard from the Incremental Development Alliance last week, and this is a big part of their group as well. And this is again generally a great group to work with. You just got to understand that they don't fully understand necessarily what they're getting into at first. They may do a couple of projects. As they do more, they're going to get more experience. And if you're lucky, they'll do a couple more and they become a mid-sized or regional developer. So these are developers who are often locals. And by local, I mean probably within a county or so. And they may have started as a mom and pop developer, or a construction company who just saw the developers that they were working for making money. And the guy said, well, we can do that. And so they start their own development company. These are folks that they've done different types of projects. They've seen different things. They've done different types. They've seen different levels of difficulty. My guess is that they've probably started in most instances with doing some sort of new construction, whether that's residential or commercial, and then have started to get into doing downtown buildings. That's typically the pathway that we see for a lot of developers. But they have a team. And unlike the mom and pops who are literally, the dual spouse team, or an investment group of those types of folks, the mid-sized regional developer actually has a team, and they have a CFO, and they have firms that they work with. So it's a team, but it's a smaller team. And so you'll see folks who wear a lot of different hats on those teams. But again, they start to have a much more professional outward-facing operation than does the mom and pop. They know that there are incentives out there, but they don't know necessarily how to use them or how to access them. They just know that that money's out there and they'd like to be able to try to leverage it if they can. But again, this is another great level of developer to work with, because again, they've got that experience, and they might have been burned on a project or two, but they've also been successful on a project or two, and they're still doing it. And this is another great group to work with. I forgot about this last bullet point, to be honest. This is not the developer that wants to do everything. We've seen a few times where this mid-sized regional developer gets into a space and they end up buying a building, and they end up buying a second building, and they end up buying a third building. And the problem happens when they do that is that they've got to make the first one go before they're able to make the second and third ones go. And so, one of the reasons that you see them avoid that often is because that's too much risk, too much capital, because if the first one falls through, then the second and third are kind of lost as well. That's, again, but still a great group to work with. And then the last one is the big time developer. My guess for you guys is that you'd see developers out of Richmond, probably developers out of DC, probably some folks maybe out of North Carolina. So you'd see it in some of your larger cities. But these are folks that, they're either big in your state or they're going to be multi-state, especially there on the East Coast. You get a lot of multi-state developers. These are sophisticated developers. These are folks who, not only is it what they do for a living, like they employ a couple of, my guess is between 50 to 100 people. They've got marketing teams, they've got finance teams, they have environmental contractors, they might even have environmental people on staff. This is a professional development company. They know what they're doing. They've got a model that they follow, and they follow that model and they make money. They know the incentives, they know how to leverage them, they know how to access them, they know who to talk to at the state or local level. Again, they're another good group to work with, but they are strictly market and ROI driven. There's no thought of legacy here. There's no thought of, we can wait for 10 years to sell this. They've got a 7-year, my guess, it's typically a 7-year out, if not before. What we typically see in these big developers, they do one of two things. Either they're a buy and hold or a build and sell. And so the build and sell happens when they actually go through, they develop the property, they're able to get their developer fee out of that project. And then once the building is completed, they sell it to a real estate management company. And then they'll take that money and they move on to the next project or two projects. So they're very much transaction driven. They know what they're doing. That's one of the nice parts about them is that, you're not going to surprise them because they've probably seen it all and they're ready for just about anything. And they do a ton of due diligence. So for you larger cities, this is probably a good target. The ideal sweet spot, I think, for a lot of you is that mid-sized developer. But again, dealing with mom and pops in smaller communities, and you may run into a mom and pop in a larger community. The problem with a mom and pop in a larger community is when they really kind of get drugged down in process. They don't understand. A much larger city has, oftentimes it feels like more complicated processes, whether it is or not, is kind of immaterial. If it gets overwhelming for them, so you'll see less of them in that space. So that's where the mid-sized developer and big-time developer you'll see more often in those larger cities. They do have the ability to do big projects. So if you've got a 100-acre site or if you've got a 40-acre site, they can do this if the profit's there. The money's got to make sense. The incentives have to make sense. A lot of them, you'll find two camps in the development world, especially with the big developers. Ones who want absolutely nothing to do with incentives. They want everything to be market driven. And there are others who want to leverage incentives as much as they can. It's strictly a philosophical standpoint from their standpoint. They want to, part of it is how much can other people tell me what to do and what not to do with my property versus how much return am I getting from that incentive. So you'll see both of those in this category. They're not entirely risk averse, but the risk in the market matter a lot. And so what I mean by that is that if it's a brownfield site, as an example, they won't necessarily shy away from it. They won't walk away immediately, but it's going to have to make money. It's going to have to be a good project for them to be able to turn around and make a good ROI on. Let's talk about priority properties real quick. Well, let me ask any questions. Does anybody have any questions on the developers?
Nothing in the chat box, but any questions from anyone? Go ahead and raise your hand. So we may be at a place that you are just so thorough, Joe, that everyone is getting everything they need.
I really hope that's the case, and I hope it's not everybody's kind of nodded off. That's really the
Or they can't set that sandwich down in order to type the question in. Either
that could
way.
be.
Thanks, Jeff.
Either way, we're moving on. That's the key. So let's talk a little bit about priority properties. Obviously, the priority properties are the ones that are currently for sale. I think there's a lot of times we get enamored with a particular building or a site. If it's not in the hands of a cooperative owner, it's not worth doing. So let's start with the properties who are currently for sale. Then we move into publicly owned or Main Street controlled properties. I know a lot of city owns property, whether that's a vacant property or a building that's been deeded over to either the city or the Main Street organization. We've seen that happen a number of times. So those are certainly important. And then we look at things like vacant sites or underused sites, and I put a big old asterisk there for the biggest of reasons. You have to have willing and cooperative owners. Again, if you've got a problem property and it's an out-of-state owner and they don't communicate, you still pursue that, go down that path, but don't go looking for a developer for it right now because they're not willing. And all that's going to do is drive up the price. So it's important to get to work with those folks to get them over to your side so they understand, that you're trying to help them, but you really need to work with what I refer to as the coalition of the willing. And what's going to happen is for those problem properties that you're probably really worried about, that they're not owned by willing or cooperative owners, they're going to start hearing about you helping other property owners sell their property and do something with it. And that's going to make them start to ask questions like, well, why aren't you doing that with ours? And, well, yours isn't for sale, or if you're interested, we're happy to do that. So you start with that coalition of the willing, and that starts to bring around the problem property owners at some point as well. So let's talk about properties currently for sale. These are ones that are currently realtor listed. Again, this may sound basic to some of you, and I'm sure it will be basic to some of you. But we've worked in communities in pretty large cities we're talking 100,000 cities, 100,000 population cities, where there are no properties listed for sale by realtors. It is all done by either property owns it, or the property owner who owns it has selling it by seller, or they just simply don't have a sign out front at all. But you want to make sure that as you're looking to market properties, that you're dealing with realtors. Again, this goes to that aspect of wanting to build that relationship with the realtors, but you want to prioritize those who are realtor listed. And when you get that pushback from those property owners to say, well, why are you only working with those properties and not mine? Well, we're working with professional realtors first. That's our priority, because these are the people who have dedicated time to helping to do these projects too. It's really important as we have these conversations with realtors that they are not seeing you as competition. You are simply trying to help them do their job. And you're giving them all these different free resources to do it. And the idea is simply to help them sell that property or lease that property. Make sure that you're promoting this stuff on your websites and on your social media as well. If you don't have an available property listing on your Main Street website, as an example, then I think you're doing your community, your district a disservice. I went through and I looked at a bunch of websites over the last week or so. And I always have a hard time, because I think the thing that we do in Main Street, though probably not the best, is promoting these different vacancies, because it's difficult to try to maintain and keep up with over time. But it's important that you're promoting them on your website and on your social medias as their opportunities for your community as well. And then, of course, because they're realtor listed, you want to make sure that they're on industry websites like MLS and Zoom Prospector and Op Sites. There's a number of other industry websites that are out there. But those are some of the most important ones. Also on there is, why am I blanking on the name? Name totally just jumped out of my head. But there are a number of industry commercial property realtor-based websites as well, and making sure that they're listed on those as well. One of the things I think it's important for everyone to understand is, and the reason I preach about putting these properties and putting these opportunities online so much, is because 90% of real estate investors do their research online before they see a property. So I mean, it's great that realtors put signs out in front, which is great because, again, if you drive by, you see it. But when you're looking at 90% of the real estate investor market does all their research online before they even set foot on the property, you know, you really need to make sure that you put as much information as you can out there on your websites, so they, you know, that people can find it, and again, you're marketing to those groups. At a very minimum, when you look at putting these buildings or these properties on your website, you need to have a recent photo, and typically having like a straight on photo is good. If you're able to show, you know, an aerial photo to show where it's, you know, kind of where it is in relation to other things, like all that's great. But at the very minimum, you need to have a recent photo, a square foot lease or sale price. Again, this is all very basic information. Contact info for the realtor. Don't direct them to you. I think that's really important because that helps eliminate that sense of competition for that realtor. You want to make sure that you're helping push things to that realtor. What the current zoning is for the property. Again, this could be general properties for sale or redevelopment projects. So this is all just basic stuff that you want to have on your website. And then a link to more info. So most professional realtors are going to have their own website with more information on it. Make sure you're linking back to their site. And oh yeah, you can track that with your through your website about how many folks are leaving your website and going to their website, so you can actually report back to those realtors about, you know, how many leads were generated from your website. If we want to, I think I have an example here. Yeah, this was an example from Lawrence, South Carolina. Very basic. Again, it goes into, you know, the address. It's a simple picture, and they've got a full listing where you can click through and look at it, where it talks about, you know, more than the size, talks about the lease rate. This doesn't have to be anything super fancy. It doesn't have to be anything that's going to necessarily wow anybody, but this is the base level of saying, all right, here's a property in our community. If we want to take things to that next level, if we want to be kind of extra, as the kids say these days, you can create a downloadable PDF, which you can brand and co-brand with the realtor. This is a way for us to be able to kind of help add visibility to the organization, and be able to say, hey, this is the things that we're trying to do. You can do a location map. Again, I talked about doing the aerial, but having folks understand kind of where that building is or that property is in relation to the rest of the area. Renderings, if you've done any renderings, I know a lot of different Main Street programs, they'll do architectural renderings, or they'll do you know, different visuals for various properties, or local Main Street organizations will do them as well. But to include those as part of that, visuals are really, really important. It helps inspire people to do, you know, something that, you know, you can't necessarily see on the site as it stands. Talk a little bit about what you'd like to see in that space. You know, if it's an existing building and you're just looking to fill that space, then, you know, say, hey, our community could really use, and you go back to your retail leakage data and you look at the stuff that you think your district could use, and say, our district could really use X, Y, and Z. Or if it's a, you know, a vacant parcel, we really would love to see a mixed use development here. It's important that you put out there what it is that you want. I'll talk more about that in a second. And then include market information. You know, I talked about the household income. I talked about, you know, retail leakage. Make sure that market information is part of that page where you have all these real estate listings on your website. This is one that's actually a local realtor did. This is the same property I showed you just a minute ago. This is when you click through to see the full listing. This is what the full listing looks like. This realtor happens to own 2 properties in that downtown Lawrence, and it's a PDF that you can download. It's got 3 or 4 pages to it. Again, you can see that they've got the aerial, and then the original photo that we saw on the last one. And then they included basic market demographics. If you know Esri, you know that picture to the right is an Esri graph. And again, if your city planning department has access to Esri, you know, that's something that you can easily tap into and easily get some of this information. And literally your planners can do it. And let's see, I've got an Esri account, and I could probably drop that in and do that within about 10 minutes, maybe. And that includes exporting and sending the email to you. So this is really, really easy information to get, and just plugging it into something that looks nice, that looks professional is important. So let's talk a little bit about, well, let me back up. Any questions about, you know, some of that basic marketing?
No questions on the basic marketing, but everyone chimed in LoopNet at the same time. Is that the web?
Thank you. I totally blanked on that. Yeah, LoopNet. Duh. Yes. As a matter of fact, I was on there like yesterday afternoon. So yeah, sorry about that. All right, so let's talk about.
We had your back.
I appreciate that. So let's talk a little bit about finding a developer. First of all, typically when you have a locally controlled piece of property, and so what I mean by locally controlled, if it's city owned or Main Street owned or Main Street controlled, and what I mean by controlled means doesn't necessarily mean it has to be ownership. It could be an option on a property. So and what an option is, if you're not familiar with the term, it's going to a property owner saying, I want to buy this, I want to be able to secure this property. I want to be able to find a buyer for this property. So I want exclusive rights to buy the property. And you can do that. And typically there's, it's either done for free, which not a whole lot of people do, or you can, basically put down good faith money and say, we're willing to put down, $5,000 or $10,000 or whatever to secure this option for the next year or 2 years as we try to find a developer for this property. So then you control that site and you can then give that option and make it what's called an assignable option, assign that option to a developer to do that. So, and then typically you go through what's either called an RFP or an RFQ process. Now, a lot of communities go, the RFP is a default, and I am a big believer in RFQ versus RFP, and I'm going to go into that in just 1 second. There are things that are called property information packages, which are often rolled into an RFQ or an RFP. And I'll give you some examples about that here in a second. If you want to go kind of next level, doing some basic pro forma development, so starting to crunch those numbers, so either yourself or a consultant or whoever it is that you have do this, and I know you guys have the IRF grants that can help pay for this type of work, where you have a consultant who will come in and talk to construction companies, do some research on your commercial lease rates and all that kind of stuff, and start to put together some sample pro formas to say, all right, here's what we think is could work. And if you start to include that level of information, I'll show you some examples here in a minute, that puts your property ahead of other types of properties that people are considering. Because again, the more information, the easier you make this for developers, the higher the likelihood that they're gonna work with you. So part of this is doing a lot of this due diligence and getting things set up to make it an easy yes. And then again, talking a little bit about incentives, what is the community willing to do? What incentives are available at the local and state level to be able to help make that happen? But let me jump into RFP versus RFQ. This is that's a lot of acronyms right there. The request for proposal is a traditional municipal mechanism, and RFPs are built on the way cities have always bought things, and it's basically it's geared around defined projects and known variables. And what I mean by that is when a city goes through a procurement process and they're looking for a new cruiser for the police department, or they're looking to buy, paper or lawn equipment for the parks department, they know what they're looking for. They need a car that does this. They need a lawnmower that does that. They need this amount of paper. Like the parameters for what they're procuring or what they're buying are very defined. They're very limited, and there's very few variables that go into play there. The problem with that is that when we're dealing with real estate, there are so many unknown variables, especially when we talk about either an existing building or the property itself. Unless the city has a really detailed environmental report, as an example, but even if that environmental report is incredibly detailed, there's always the chance that as soon as a shovel goes into the ground or a backhoe goes into the ground, they might find a tank. They might find a 55-gallon drum that nobody knew was there. And all of a sudden, you've got a different problem or a different piece of property than you did 15 minutes ago. So
Joe?
Yes.
We do have a question, and I'm also just going to admit, when you said shovel into the ground, you may have a tank, and the first thing I thought about was an army tank, and I thought, why would that be there? Anyway, so we do have a question. What type of company does these sample pro formas? So do you have any recommendations for how a community finds someone to put a pro forma together?
Okay, so drawing the line here. So it is something that we do at Place in Maine. And I know that there are a couple. I'd have to look up to see kind of who our main competitors are in that area, and I'm happy to provide that information when we get off the call, because I don't recall off the top of my head if they work in Virginia or not. So I'm happy to give you guys that information. But there's a lot of other development companies sometimes will do that work, but there are other consultant companies. Who am I thinking of? There's a guy I know who doesn't work in Virginia. He's based out of Ohio. I'm blanking on his name off the top of my head. I'll have to look it up.
We can revisit it at the end.
Yeah, let's revisit that at the end. I'll look him up at some point when we get a pause and be able to tell you what I think he does that kind of work too. But there are several folks that do this type of work. All right, so the RFP, as I mentioned, is really kind of about those defined variables. The RFQ is really designed to be built on relationships. So the RFQ, the difference, when we talk about RFP versus RFQ when it comes to real estate, when we expect the developer to do an RFP, as an example, we expect them to present essentially a baked plan. When we say, we've got this building, we've got this piece of property, we want to see an RFP from a developer that tells us what they want to do exactly with this property. And when a developer does that, there's a couple of big flags with that. Developers hate to do RFPs for the most part, because what you're asking them to do is to expend a ton of time and money in telling you exactly what they do, given the variables that they know, but to spend money on an architect, to spend money on, all the big marketing pieces and all the stuff that's so customized around this particular piece of property, that you're asking them to spend a lot of money with zero guarantee whatsoever that they're going to see anything from it. And so developers will respond to that if it's a really competitive market. But if it's not, they generally don't. They don't like to spend money if they don't know they're going to get some of that back. And so one of the ways that we can kind of hack that is by doing this RFQ. And the RFQ is built on relationships. And all an RFQ is asking for is asking for folks who know what they're doing, and be able to show that they know what they're doing. So you can say, we're going to do an RFQ for a developer, and we're looking for developers who do this type of property, and give us an example of your work. So those type of RFQ responses then include, a resume of the developer, a development portfolio. It's all stuff that they already have to do for RFPs anyways. That's stuff that's not customized, but it talks about all the stuff that they do and their background. And that allows you to at least identify those developers who do what you're looking for them to do. When you go through the RFQ process, then you can identify those top 2 or 3 developers, and then finally pick a developer based on what you think is going to be a good fit for your community. And then you enter into what's called a pre-development agreement. And so that kind of gives them exclusivity. And I always say the difference between RFP and RFQ is the difference between marriage and dating. And asking for an RFP is you're asking for a proposal, like for a marriage proposal. An RFQ is just asking to date. We want to see who's out there. We want to see who can do this type of work. And we want to, not necessarily have a firm commitment, but at least have a commitment that we're going to, work on this a little bit and see what we get. And you can go through the RFQ process, identify a developer, do a pre-development agreement. You go through the process with them where they actually then start to feel like, okay, I can spend money on this project. We'll see whether this works, because we know you're not talking to 5 other developers while we're doing this. So I'll spend some money doing that. And then they come back and say, you know what, this is a go. We want to do it. Or no, you know what, we've done more due diligence on it. We're not comfortable. We're going to back out of this deal, and you guys can go find somebody else if you want. And that way, there's no hard feelings, but there's a whole process built around the RFQ. As a matter of fact, that chart I showed you earlier is really around the RFQ process more than it is around the RFP process, because it anticipates things like a pre-development agreement to be able to allow you to kind of get to the process where you're, just minimizing that requirement on behalf of the developer to show them that they're interested in you, but not require them to expend a lot of money. As I mentioned, the RFP is time consuming, it's expensive, there's no guarantee. RFQs are much faster, they're less expensive, and you're probably get it much in the projects that we've worked in. There's a higher response rate for the RFQ than there is an RFP, just because of these factors. It's important for these major properties that we're looking at that there's a community vision involved, that the community is engaged. It's not just this developer coming in and proposing. This is one of the reasons I like the RFQ, is that it's not necessarily asking for a finished product. It's asking for, tell us who's done this type of work before, because what we want to do in this process is what we really want to do is engage the community and see what the community wants there. Because if you're able to go through this process and you engage the community and they come up with a vision and the developer is able to achieve that vision, then that permitting process, that public hearing process, all that other stuff that goes into development is a breeze if the developer is able to fulfill that vision. But it's really difficult for a developer to kind of hit a moving target if the community's never said what they want in that space. So we think it's really important that when you're creating this community vision, that you're engaging the community through public visioning, that you're doing things like surveys and getting feedback. And again, that's something you do once you've identified a developer and then gone through this process with the RFQ, where you're able to kind of say, all right, help us figure out what should go in this space. We've got some thoughts, it's zoned for this. This is what we're thinking. And then be able to start that conversation with the community. And that becomes a much more inclusive process. At the end of the day, you're basically just asking, what do we want to see there and what do we want it to look like? And again, it's something that helps stir and create community pride as well, because people are able to see kind of their input in that process without it being a contentious process like in a public hearing. Because a public hearing, when you do this stuff in a public hearing, whether or not there's an approval on the line, like it becomes high stakes, it becomes pretty tense. If you're able to do this in a public visioning session, it's a different story. It's much more of a conversation. It becomes a better experience for developers in the community as well. I always tell communities this is, if you take nothing else from today, I want you to remember this. If the developer isn't the tool for the community's vision, then the community will be the tool for the developer's vision. And what I mean by this is that I've worked with a lot of developers in my career, and the developers that I've worked with build a product. And whatever that product is what they tend to vision in that space. So unless you give a developer an alternate vision for what you want to see in that space, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to see their product in that space. And the applicability of that is, if you're a community and you have a vacant parcel, I'll give you an example right here. This is in Jackson, Michigan. The community had this parcel. If you had a developer who builds strip malls, and the city went out for an RFP or an RFQ for a developer on this, what a strip mall developer would do is they'd look at that and go, man, that's a great spot for a strip mall. But what the city didn't want to do, that. What they want to do is they want to put forth a vision. Say, you know what, we think this is a really important corner in our town. It's the entryway to downtown. We want to see something that's mixed use. And they looked at their zoning regs and they looked at all the things that they could do and say, all right, what can we build here? And what they ended up doing was they went out for an RFQ for this. And so instead of just promoting this site, they said, we want to find a developer that helps us build something like this. And so we want to do an RFQ. We want to find developers who've done something like this. And it's taking them a little bit longer. It's not, an easy process necessarily where they got it right on the first try. They went out for RFQ twice for this project, but they've now found a developer and they've broken ground on it. So this project's moving forward because what they did was they said, we don't just want a strip mall. We want something that's going to fit with downtown. So they put forth that vision. Oops, wrong way. This is some pre-development services that we completed recently. This is in Farmington, Michigan. This was a partnership between the city, the Downtown Development Authority, and the private owners, as well as the State Economic Development Corporation. So this would kind of be the equivalent of an IRF grant that they received. And this is a property that's owned by a family that has owned it for 50 years. They make dental equipment, and they're retiring. And it's a spot they weren't sure what to do with, and so they said, we want to find something that's going to help be good for the community. They just didn't want to put a for sale sign out. So the city partnered with the family that was selling it, and we put together this document for them. And it's a pre-development service. We call it an RFQ document because it's what it is. It's an RFQ where they've put it out to developers. But just to show you kind of what a nice version of these look like, you can do something that's much more basic, and we've certainly done things that are much more basic. But I like this document in particular because I'm going to show you why we give some additional thoughts on it. We include things like, tell us about the environment that it's around. So it's about downtown, in downtown Farmington. So we highlight downtown Farmington. We included things like we used geofencing, and we're able to kind of tell more information about the downtown market in general. So we were able to show, you can see on the upper right-hand side, this is a heat map of where people go when they're in the district, and we kind of highlighted where the existing property is, so you can see, where the restaurants were, where the grocery store is, and then talked about things like traffic counts. We're able to put forth a pretty professional looking document for developers. We get into the trade area itself. We talk about the trade area. We talk about population and household income, the things that I talked about. We did a retail leakage analysis. This, what you see on the right-hand side, is the only thing that out of the retail leakage analysis that we included in the document, because it's a marketing document. It wasn't designed to be a market analysis. So what we wanted to create was enough information that made the site look attractive, that showed that there was significant potential for the site. Now, what we did with all this data afterwards is we turned around, we put it in a different we created a different marketing document for them and gave it to them as well as all the data. So they had all that stuff, but the idea was really around, how do we create this marketing document for this piece? And then we went into development scenarios. So we're really fortunate. We partner with a great design firm out of Detroit called Archive DS. And we do, we've got 4 or 5 projects with them where they're able to they draw out all of these, the potential site layouts. So we're able to show kind of what the first and second floors would look like. And then, we've crunched numbers and we've been asked, we offer those to potential developers, but it's not part of this actual document where we do the pro forma development in this one. And then we get into redevelopment incentives. This shows you the 2 pages of redevelopment incentives that kind of outline who to contact, what they are, and how they could be used. And then at the end of this, there's actually a process, and I'll talk about it here in a second, where they did a developer showcase. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. So let's talk about creating a pro forma. If you're not familiar with what a pro forma is, it's a financial projection. First and foremost, there's really kind of 2 parts to a pro forma. There's the construction pro forma, and then there's the operating pro forma. And the construction pro forma is basically what we call the sources and uses, but where the money's coming from, how's it going to be spent, and the operating pro forma shows, all right, what do we estimate the cost to be to operate it on an annual basis? And by putting those 2 things together, we're able to kind of show how a developer can create what we call an internal rate of return, or another term that people use all the time is ROI, is to be able to show how they can financially benefit from some of this. And I'll show you an example of how we did this in a marketing document here in just a second. So this was a project that we did with Orion Planning and Development. They're based out of Hernando, Mississippi, and this was in Pascagoula, Mississippi, right along the Gulf Coast. And we did the financial pro forma piece of this. We worked with other firms that did market analysis as part of this. And then, of course, Orion Planning and Design did all the great design, what you're about to see. So in this case, we were hired by the city to come in and do, I believe it was 6 or 8 properties, those 6 properties in their downtown core, and create what we call this portfolio investment document. And the interesting part of this is we ended up doing, as we were there, we ended up looking at, I believe it was 9 properties. And the reason that we looked at 9 properties instead of 6 was, as we were doing this process and starting to put out information on it, there were property owners that lived in the community that were interested, that knew what we were doing, saw what we were doing there, and then started buying the properties before we could get to them, and put them in the document. And so the 3 of the properties that we had originally targeted to be a part of this document were already in the process of being redeveloped by the time we finished this document. So we ended up subbing in 3 other ones and just said, all right, that's fine. We'll move ahead, because we were so excited that we saw people turn around and actually using this document before it's even done to be able to do that. So I wanted to give this example because I think this is one of the coolest ones. This is a single-story commercial building. It's historic, and then we talked to them, and we went kind of around with the State Historic Preservation Office. The State Historic Preservation Office said they'd consider doing historic tax credits on the project, even if we did multi-level. So we were able to kind of show them, all right, here's what it would look like if you were to kind of rehab that building and then add a second level. Again, the architects do an amazing job of this stuff, of being able to kind of demonstrate the visibility there. And then this is a kind of our piece on the left-hand side. We were able to show them, the acquisition costs. This is a very simple pro forma, by the way, and because the reason we do it this way as a simple pro forma is again, it's a marketing document. we have a full pro forma that we also give, again, the potential developers, and that's like a 10-page document. And so it's much more detailed. It goes into much more kind of the nitty gritty and into the weeds. But we want to at least be able to show, all right, here's kind of an onset of what we think could be used for a performer to be able to look at this. So we were able to kind of show, based on estimated income and based on incentives and based on redevelopment costs, that we estimated a return on investment of about 6%. Excuse me for 1 second. Here's a couple more examples of just some of the properties. But again, what we were able to do for the city there was the city then had this document, and their Main Street organization there had this document that they put out on their website, and they were able to solicit development interest, because we were able to show them, view beyond what's there. And that's, I think, one of the important things of some of these pre-development RFQ types of documents. So in addition, I know we're coming up on time here before too long. I want to be able to open up for any other additional questions. Any other information that you think is important about the site? So previous brownfield studies, feasibility, any previous feasibility studies that have been done, recent or future nearby public investment. That's really important. It's important for the private sector to see that the public sector is putting money into the area as well. So any other information that's currently going on in or around that site is incredibly important to make sure that we're including as well. It's one thing to have one document, but it's also to be able to say, hey, we've got this additional stuff as well. So let's talk a little bit about finding a developer. The big time developer, regional developer, the mom and pop. First of all, you want to do research. You need to figure out kind of who these folks are. You need to treat, I don't want to say necessarily like just throwing your hook in the water. And that's essentially just when you put it just on your website. And again, you can get fish by just throwing a hook in the water. But you want to make sure that you're going to target who you're going to go after and who you want to respond. So you do a little research and see who's done projects either nearby or in your state that fit or you go along with kind of what you want to do. So you know kind of who you're going to want to target and send this to specifically, in addition to having it posted openly, of course. And then make contact, start to build those relationships and just explain kind of who you are, what your project is, and just say, listen, we're thinking about doing an RFQ for this. We think you'd be a good candidate to respond. And let me tell you something. I have yet to meet a developer who's gotten a phone call from a city saying, hey, we're going to do an RFQ. We think you'd be a great person to respond to this. I've heard developers say no, but it doesn't make them angry. And they can typically, when they say no, it's, we're in the middle of another project right now. We don't have any capacity to do it, versus, oh God, the city was getting a hold of me. People love to be contacted about this stuff. They want to know about what, these opportunities. So make sure that you're reaching out, you're building those relationships, and that you're, connecting with them and telling them about them in general. Again, the RFQ process itself, throwing that hook out a little bit, but again, the more you're able to show a developer that you're serious and that the community's behind it and that you're putting time and energy and effort and money into it, the more likely they're going to take it serious, because there's a million vacant properties out there. And being able to show them that this is a priority for us is going to show it's going to rise in their level of consideration. I also want to throw out the idea of doing a developer day. I mentioned this just a few minutes ago, talking about Farmington. Identify 3 to 5 targets at a minimum. Buy them lunch, and do your pitch and do a quick site tour. Again, I did this a couple of month and a half ago. This was Farmington. This was the follow-up to our document. And the State Economic Development Corporation was there, talked about their incentives. The city was there. Hosted a bunch of folks, and I believe this one drew 6 development teams, and literally took them for a walk. And it was, on the onset, you look at the fact that they are tearing up the streetscape literally right in front of this building. But what they were able to talk about was, here's what the streetscape's going to look like here in the next 3 months, because we're in the middle of making all this investment into the community. And so it became a very kind of powerful visual. And then, of course, we went and looked at the actual physical site and walked around it so they could see, it in relation to the surrounding properties. So I think that's always a great idea if you can get 3 to 5 folks. And the other part of this I love is, especially around the RFQ, is that it makes it a little bit competitive. When other developers see other developers there, then they start to go, there must be something there, because this guy's interested in it, or this gal's interested in it. So making sure that, you're trying to get as many people, as many sets of eyes on it as you can is important. And then lastly, making sure that the RFQ is posted on your social media, on your websites, making sure you're reaching out to the American Planning Association, your State Planning Association, Urban Land Institute. All these groups have free ability to post your RFQ. So make sure that you're using all those channels as well. And there are developers, I'll tell you, especially as part of ULI, there are developers who are part of that group who will look for those RFQs in those spots as well. Lastly, if we're going to if you wouldn't mind, Rebecca, putting in the chat, we did just a quick handout for you to take away from today, just kind of a quick checklist and some quick questions and answers. If you guys if your community hasn't done any of this stuff, this is a great starting point, and this is a good way for you to use this as a check against kind of what you currently have as resources for either developers who are looking to go in or potential businesses into your downtown. So if you'd be kind enough to throw that in the chat, I'd appreciate that. And then I'd be happy to answer any questions folks might have.
All right. Well, we added that link to the chat box for everyone. So Jenny is noting for you, Joe, that was so informative. And I would like to echo that I facilitate a lot of webinars. I sit in on a lot of webinars. This was so helpful today. Dominique Dubose from Phoebus. Dominique, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Hi. So I have a quick question. How would you recommend, I guess, navigating an environment or a relationship where your community kind of has one main developer that has a really good relationship with your city, with your board and everything, but it's kind of just one main guy who buys up and develops, when you kind of really want a little more diversity and creativity?
Right. No, matter of fact, I did a presentation a month ago, and I talked about some of the problem folks, and I said the only thing that's almost as bad, the only thing that's less worse than somebody who owns nothing is a person who owns everything. And because what happens then is they start to dictate the market. And I think, making the argument for doing an RFQ is, or an RFP, either one, is to say, listen, we need to make sure that there's a healthy competition here. And yeah, we've got, somebody who's local, who's great. But, having more than one owner is good too, because then, resorting back to the competition benefiting the marketplace, and, I get the sense that, Virginia is a lot like Michigan, in which, I always say you've got to be able to speak, both blue and red, or Republican and Democrat, and at the local level, I know that's could be even more so. But to be able to talk about things like saying, hey, we need to make sure that we've got good competition for the property, we get good competition for the businesses, and by doing that, we need to have literally competition. We need, it's great that this person's here, and we love that they're doing all this work. But we need to make sure that we have other folks too, to diversify, we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, great question, Dominique. Anyone else want to raise their hand, unmute themselves, type a question in the chat box?
I'm gonna end this. I'm gonna end this.
Yeah.
My real quick, but I just want to point out on our contact information, that's a phone number. You can either call or text. I love to text as much as I love to talk to folks. And then the @Place in Maine is literally all of the socials is the same handle, so it's @Place in Maine.
And I am going to go ahead and also drop the link to Joe's slides in the chat box. So now you all will have his contact information right at your fingertips. Pamela Mason Wagner, you have a question in the chat box and your hand raised. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, so the question really is, we have a small city, 25,000 population, and many of the people who work in our city government, they're like one-person departments. And so I guess I'm asking you, if you meet resistance to people being helpful in one department, where are the places you can go for help within a small city government?
Oh man, this is so much bigger than you know, honestly, I think it's important to have good relationships with all those departments. It's most important to have good relationships with city administration, with department heads. And then, you know, I hate to go necessarily to council after that, but it's important to make sure that you have good relationships across the board in the administration and on the political side, so on the council as well. So that way, if you encounter a roadblock, you can either go, you know, again, if it's a one-person shop, I get it, but then you got to go to the city administrator, and if that city administrator is the block, then you got to go to the mayor, then you've got to go to the council members, and not necessarily to tell on them, but just to say, you know, hey, we've encountered this problem, and we're trying to figure out how to get there. And to me, that's the way it's been the most, the most beneficial in the past.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, great questions. And right now the chat is singing Joe's praises and thanking us for the information. And we have a few more minutes. So any other questions from anyone? I think that it was really interesting to hear the number of communities in the Virginia Main Street world that market properties on their website versus those that don't. And I definitely understand the constraints around the human resources for keeping all of that up to date. Yeah. Bluegrass Resource Center, I think that is Betty Mitchell.
Yes, thank you, Rebecca. Joe, any thoughts on, we've got a property that we're working on developing in the community and looking for an operator for it. I mean, it seems like a lot of what you've said could be applicable to that, but just your thoughts on identifying operators.
So when you say operator, what do you mean by operator?
So we've got a historic inn that we're going to put back into an inn and looking for an operator for it. The nonprofit doesn't want to do that.
Yeah, I would say, you know, again, it's almost kind of the same approach as for business development would be to look at, you know, your surrounding neighbors, you know, who runs a good inn, you know, and look at the competition and say, you know, hey, we've got this opportunity to do this. And I think part of the thing I think you guys need to wrestle with a little bit is, it's great that you guys are doing that development portion, that you're looking for that operator, but how's that, you know, have you guys done the math to figure out how the operator is going to make money? Because if you're able to show an operator how they're going to make money, it's going to make a much easier conversation to have with a potential operator than just saying, hey, we've got this great real estate project that we're doing. We want you to come, you know, run it for us. It's, you know, you got to be able to kind of to make the math easy. There's a million ways for people to say no. I mean, to me, this is kind of like, I'm totally blanking on the guy's name. How to Win Friends and Influence People. But, you know, make it hard for them to say no. And by making it hard for them to say no, then, you know, by default, you're going to get to yes. But how you get to that, to those operators, is to find those other inns in the area. And I think the problem that you're going to run into is that inns in particular are run by the people who often live there or they live close by. So finding an operator, I think, will be difficult, to be honest. But I would say start with the other inns and see if there's a parent corporation that there'd be a way for them to do an agreement with you. Oh, somebody just said Zig Ziglar. Right on.
All right. 2 more minutes of Joe's time.
It's going to be really painful if I just have to sit here in silence.
Yeah, we're going to keep everyone until 1:30.
Dale Carnegie, thank you. That was, by the way, Dale Carnegie was, Zig Ziglar is an amazing follow, by the way, but Dale Carnegie is the book I was talking of. Thank you. And Betty, Pamela Wagner just made a comment in the chat about reaching out to Blackburn Inn in Stanton.
And Pamela, I also dropped the millwald.org into the chat box. That is a nonprofit group that is rehabbing the Millwald Theater in Woodville, Virginia. So they may have some resources and recommendations for you very specific to theater projects. If I recommend talking to that group, since they have recently done a lot of some of the same things that y'all are looking to do.
And who specifically would you suggest? Because I do know one person there, but I don't know if she's the right person.
Mark Bloomfield.
Thank you.
Tell him Rebecca sent you.
Okay.
Well, it is 1:30, and Joe, honestly, thank you so much. This has been great information, and I have a feeling you'll be hearing from some communities in Virginia, and I hope that this is just the first of many appearances for Joe Borgstrom here in the state.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Rebecca. I appreciate everybody staying awake for the whole thing, and look forward to hopefully being in Virginia more.
And we do have some speakers a week from today. Kathy Lowe, formerly with the town of Abingdon, and Sandy Ratliff with Virginia Community Capital, and we'll be talking about small businesses in your community next week, 1 week from today. We will be posting the recording from this webinar online, so you'll be able to access that. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.